Okay, I think we'll make a start. So good evening, everyone, or morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Dr Imogen Dalziel. I'm the Programme Coordinator for the Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership, and I am delighted to be hosting this event this evening, Outside the Gates of Auschwitz, Sightseeing, Education and Commemoration. Just a couple of housekeeping technical points before we get started. First of all, as you will have just heard, the event is being recorded. Only speakers' cameras will be shown in the recording, so feel free to keep your cameras on if you'd like to. We're also using automatic closed captioning for this event. You can access this at the bottom of your screen at the live transcript button. We have to apologise that this won't be perfect as it is automatic as we're going along, but hopefully it will be as accessible as possible. We will have time for an audience Q&A at the end of the session. If you would like to ask a question, we would ask that you put this in the chat directly either to myself or to my colleague Olivia Oakley, who you'll find in the participant list. And also Olivia will be putting in some key references and links throughout our discussion so that you can access any of the websites, any of the projects that we will be talking about this evening later on. And when the video is uploaded to YouTube, these will also be put in the description as well. So, since its official opening in 1947, the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, the site of what was once the largest Nazi concentration and extermination camp, has welcomed millions of visitors and has become an infamous symbol of the Holocaust and genocide, if not the symbol. Over the last several years, however, efforts have been made to bring the history and memory of the former camp to as wide an audience as possible, which has become even more important but challenging in the wake of the current coronavirus pandemic. Tonight, we will discuss the role of sightseeing, that is SITE, to borrow the term from Alistair Richardson and his paper, and how this has been impacted by the creation of travelling exhibitions and digital spaces. So we have three fantastic speakers joining us tonight. Firstly, I'm delighted to introduce Paul Salmons. Paul is the director of Paul Salmons Associates. He is a consultant to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the chief curator of Seeing Auschwitz, and the curator of Museala's award-winning Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. And we will hear a little bit more about these exhibitions shortly. Secondly, we have Paweł Sawicki, who is press and PR officer at the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. Paweł is responsible for the museum's social media, and amongst his many other roles, he works as a tour guide, an English-Polish translator, and a photographer at the memorial as well. So welcome to you, Paweł. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Clementine Smith, who is Director of Programmes and Deputy Managing Director at the Holocaust Educational Trust. Clementine has been involved in the Trust's Lessons from Auschwitz project, the online version particularly, which we will hear more about this evening as well. And she has previously led the Trust's Ambassador Programme. And from personal experience, I can say, as a graduate, if you like, of the LFA project and having been a regional ambassador myself, then I can attest to the life-changing impact potentially of that project. So welcome all. I'd like to start with some sort of individual presentations or some sort of discussion about what your projects are and how they relate to this idea of taking the history and memory of Auschwitz outside the gates. So if we could start with Paul, could you tell us a little bit about the travelling exhibitions about Auschwitz in which you're involved and how these evolved from the initial concept to physical exhibitions?
Sure, and thank you, Imogen, for inviting me. Delighted to be here. So the exhibition Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away began as the vision of Luis Ferrero, who is director of the Spanish exhibition company Musealia. Luis was deeply moved when he read Viktor Frankl's book, The Man's Search for Meaning, and that work had such a profound impact on him that he felt compelled to bring the story of Auschwitz to a much wider audience and undertook to develop a major travelling exhibition on its history and significance. In terms of how the exhibition developed, it was always intended to be very large in size. It's the world's largest exhibition on the history and significance of Auschwitz, in order to make, I think, a very strong cultural statement in the cities to which it travelled. That's why the partnership of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum has also been so invaluable. Several hundred objects from the museum form the core of the exhibition, from concrete fence posts and barbed wire to the office desk of the Commandant Rudolf Höss, to a three-tiered wooden bunk that inmates slept upon in the prisoner barracks, to the items of ordinary daily life that deportees brought with them to the camp, objects that are really the last trace that exists that they ever lived. Their spectacles, their shoes, perfume bottles, buttons, the shaving brushes, tea strainers, cooking pots. But there are also a number of key interpretive principles that developed and guided our work. So as we set about creating this exhibition, we decided we didn't want to build an exhibition that replicated a visit to the site itself. We didn't want to, for instance, begin at the entrance gate of Arbeit macht frei and then walk visitors through a history of Auschwitz barrack by barrack. Rather, we wanted to answer the question of how this place was possible in the modern world, to situate Auschwitz in its context, to take it as a kind of orienting point that we could move in and out of for the wider history. So, for example, to explore the history and pre-war life of Oswiecim, from there the pre-war life of Jews, Roma and others in modern Europe, to relate the history of Auschwitz to the wider history, the impact of the First World War, the rise of the Nazis, the unfolding of the Second World War. And it was important then for us to show that Auschwitz was not only the Holocaust, even though it's a strong symbol of the Holocaust, and also that the Holocaust was more than Auschwitz. So it's not only an Auschwitz exhibition, it's about Auschwitz in its much wider context. In our so-called post-truth era, with concerns about denial and distortion, misinformation, we wanted to present the tangible evidence of these crimes, much of it the voices of the victims throughout. This is why we also deepened and enriched the exhibition with hundreds of artifacts from a further 30 institutions around the world, including some very important material from the Wiener Library, for example. As for our companion exhibition, Seeing Auschwitz, this originated when we were approached by the United Nations to create a new exhibition to mark the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. My main interest there was in how our picture of Auschwitz, how our collective memory has been so shaped by a relatively small number of photographs that comprise the so-called Lily Jacob album, after the Holocaust survivor that discovered that remarkable artifact. That album is the only photographic record we have of arrival and selection in a death camp, and as such, its images are not only repeated in every book, documentary film, exhibition on the Holocaust, but they're also the inspiration of so many novelists' visualization and fictionalization of Auschwitz, and they're used by feature film directors to stage their scenes, clothe and position their actors. But these photographs, of course, critically were taken by the SS. So our collective image is one that shares the gaze of the murderers themselves. And this exhibition invites the visitor to critically engage with these photographs as evidence, challenges them to see beyond the perpetrator's gaze. And it contrasts those dominant images with less well-known pictures created, for instance, by the prisoners themselves, photographs taken clandestinely by the Sonderkommando, drawings made by inmates in the camp or immediately afterwards, their visual testimony, and of photographs taken by the Allies from the air, at liberation, or as they investigated those crimes. So it's basically an exhibition about multi-perspectivity, about how we know what we know, and about the critical tools we can bring to bear on the evidence of the past.
Thank you, Paul. I had the privilege of seeing the Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away exhibition when it opened in Madrid, and I was absolutely blown away. I was in there for about 7 hours, so it's a good job I went on my own. Paweł, could you talk a little bit about how the Auschwitz Museum came to establish an online presence, particularly on social media? I'm sure many people in the audience already follow you on there, and which type of content is shared by the museum on these different platforms?
Thank you very much, Imogen, for the invitation. Yes, I mean, in the story between the authentic site of the Auschwitz Memorial and the online world, we probably can find few major points. I mean, I remember this kind of debate that I was told about when I started working at the memorial, that people were thinking whether a place like Auschwitz should have a website. And today we can just laugh a little bit about that, because every one or every institution has a website, and this is something so natural that we probably, some of the young generation do not really remember the world without websites and the internet. And similar discussion we had when social media started. And I think the reason why we decided to step in 2009, and it started with Facebook, is that we noticed that people, first of all, search for information about the history of Auschwitz in those social media. So they kind of went out of a very traditional way of research, and of course they left libraries and they went online, but they stopped searching in their browsers, and there was a completely new environment. And first of all, they were searching information. They could find, for example, pages set up by deniers, or they could simply find pages which were inaccurate. And that was the reason why we decided that perhaps the institution should be there so that people could find the content that is fact-checked, that is accurate, that people can find many information, they can ask questions. And that was that was the beginning. And we decided to start first a Facebook page. Then we are also present on Twitter and Instagram at the moment. Whether something else will happen in the future, it's difficult to say. And I think it is something extremely important. And the exhibition project that Paul was talking about, the Auschwitz not long ago, not far away, and the social media presence of the memorial, and several other projects that we have been working on, not only during the pandemic, but before the pandemics, is an expression of something which I think we started understanding in recent years. That, of course, we can look at the graph showing that from the year 2000 to 2019, the number of visitors at the Auschwitz Memorial is 4 times bigger, from around 500,000 to 2.3 million. And then, of course, the pandemic started. And we, of course, are very much engaged in education of those people. Around 80% of people are guided. We guide in 21 languages with over 340 educators. I'm one of them. And I think we're the only institution like that in the world. We do not have audio guides. We have educated professional guides who can answer questions, and they can face many challenges that a person coming to study the story in the authentic sites brings. But I think we also started noticing, and the online world only helped this, that the fact that 2.3 million people, visitors a year, are at the memorial, at the same time, there are like 6 billion or more people who do not visit the memorial a year. And at least some of them, because of course, not everyone will be interested in the history of Auschwitz, but some of them are interested, and they cannot come out of many reasons. And we should start thinking about doing something to get them engaged, to give them, every day we post facts and photographs and names and faces, and we try to explain the history. And we make them engaged, because they report different problematic things for us, problematic in terms of how the memory is shaped in this contemporary world, or how the memory is instrumentalized in many different contexts, either in the real world or in the online world. And we create community that is based, and it's always based on commemoration and education, because something that I think we could also talk about is you said that Auschwitz is the symbol of the Holocaust, and it brings many problems, because when people know about the symbol, it doesn't necessarily mean that they know facts about the historical event of the symbol. And this is our crucial role, to explain context, to explain details, to show that nothing is black and white. And we can do that through exhibition at the site and we are changing our main exhibition at the memorial. We can do it through exhibition like Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, or we can do it through social media. And then we need to create, I don't like the word offer, but I think we need to create different content. And I also do not like the word content. We need to create something. So on one hand, it will be something for a person who just briefly sees our post on Instagram and clicks a like, but it also needs to get to people who can get engaged, who want to go through a longer online lesson, and we have online lessons or a podcast, or they want to simply go deeper and ask questions and become part of this community that not necessarily must be linked with the authentic side. So there are many paths that our presence outside is reaching, but everything is based on those two fundamental things, which is commemoration of all the victims of Auschwitz and education about the very complicated history of Auschwitz.
Thank you, Paweł. Certainly before 2020, before the pandemic, a large percentage of the visitors to the museum I know were from the UK, and within that, a large percentage were coming with the Holocaust Educational Trust as part of their Lessons from Auschwitz project. So Clementine, I wonder if you could sort of briefly explain the physical version of the Lessons from Auschwitz project and how that's now been adapted to an online version in the current circumstances.
Absolutely. Imogen, thanks again for inviting us all here to talk about this this evening. In terms of the Lessons from Auschwitz project, since 1999, the Holocaust Educational Trust has run the Lessons from Auschwitz project, and the project has allowed over 40,000 people to date to take part on a 4-part course. So through the project, in terms of the visit and the site of Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, there is a 1-day visit that all participants will take part in. But that is, as I said, part of a broader project. So in terms of that project, the key aims of LFA are to ensure that people learn about the Holocaust in all its complexities, including camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau. We aim to teach young people about the geography of the Holocaust, when it happened, and we also, as well as the visit, ask that the students that come back think about the lessons and lessons that they've taken from that, and think about how they will share what they've learned from LFA and bring that to their schools and communities. In terms of the model before the pandemic, the 4-part course was cut across seminars in the UK and the visit. So the group would start with a seminar in the UK. They would be in small groups facilitated by freelance educators. In the first session, they'd be learning about the history of the Holocaust, and we would start with thinking about pre-war Jewish life. In that session, the group would also hear from a survivor. So they would hear from a Holocaust survivor firsthand. They would have time to hear their testimony, and they would also have time to ask questions. And then with the historical learning that they'd done and hearing that testimony, they would then prepare to go on a 1-day visit to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The groups would go for 1 day. They would start in Auschwitz. They would then go to Auschwitz I, and they would be with their freelance educator, but also with one of the guides, as Paweł mentioned, from the museum. So we would spend the day with them at Auschwitz I, and then we would then move over to Birkenau. Throughout the day, they would be hearing from the tour guides, but they'd also have time where educators would pose questions to get them to think about themes and issues that were coming up. When they returned from the visit, they'd have a bit of time to stop and reflect. They'd then come back together in their groups, and at a follow-up seminar, they would start debriefing, thinking about what they'd learned, what they'd heard, what they'd seen. And then they would start thinking about the 4th part of their project, which is what we refer to as their next steps. So they would go into their schools and communities, as I said, to share what they had learned. So when we hit 2020 and we realized that visits weren't possible, we had to start thinking about how we were going to present the Lessons from Auschwitz project in an online way. And there were 2 key things that we had to think about. For us, one of the key parts of the Lessons from Auschwitz project, and that we know is pivotal, is the access to that authentic site, the use of site-based learning as part of Holocaust education and commemoration. So we had to think about what is it that the group get from the sites, and how can we ensure that they're still able to access seeing the sites. Something we quickly established was that we didn't want to try and replicate a journey around the full journey that the group would do on a visit. We didn't think it would be possible. We weren't going to be with the guides from the museum, and we didn't want to try and replicate something that we didn't think we'd be able to, but also that wouldn't be as valuable when you're not there. They're different things. Seeing a site in person and seeing something online is different. So we started thinking about, how do we show the sites and ensure that that visual element where people can see the sites complements the learning. But we also had another challenge that we had to address, and that was, how do you deliver Holocaust education in an online forum? And we were thinking about the fact that this definitely wasn't as simple as taking what we would say to a group in person at our seminars and on site and having that conversation in a Zoom room. We knew that we had to think really carefully about the approach to that education, being mindful of the complexities of the history we're talking about, being mindful of the fact that we were now all in a very different place in the world. Students were not in their classrooms, they weren't with their teachers and their partners. So we started planning for those two kind of areas of thought, thinking about the online delivery and how you ensure that there are the experience of seeing the site is still accessible, and that this continues to be a memorable experience. So what the model became, so the Lessons from Auschwitz online project, is now facilitated through an online platform, a bespoke platform that we have created, where participants take part on a project that is a combination of facilitated live learning and self-guided learning. And we chose to use a combination of the two so that we could take into account that situation, that the students were in very different places that we were reaching, that we knew that actually online learning, sitting on Zoom calls for long amounts of time, wasn't the same as being in a room with people. So we've created an online platform where groups will go through this content. They start with an online session where there is a facilitated session. They start thinking about the history of the Holocaust. We start talking about the complexities of learning about the Holocaust, and we start covering in that particular session pre-war Jewish life. They are still part of breakout groups that are facilitated by our educators. But when they finish that session, they then go into the platform where they have time to access self-guided learning. And we've pulled together a guided platform where the group can access a wealth of different resources, so images, videos, text, that takes them through the learning aims of each platform. So once they've done each element of a self-guided learning, it will unlock the next piece. So we wanted to be sure that again, thinking about the kind of building the knowledge, scaffolding the knowledge that the group have, that they were able to kind of move forward in that way. And then in the second live facilitated session, the group are able to still hear from a survivor online. So we use an online platform where the group can hear a live testimony from a survivor, and they're also able to use they're also able to access a virtual reality piece where they can see 3 spaces within a Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. So they can't walk around. They're situated in one place where they see 3 very specific spaces. So they see the entrance to Auschwitz I, the Albert Mack-Frey gates. They see the unloading ramp in Birkenau, and they see one of the barracks. And we picked these spaces for very particular reasons. We wanted to allow them, and this relates to why the site-based learning we find so important to Holocaust education. We want them to look at each of these spaces to help them see the spaces they're learning about. When they start looking at the gate at Auschwitz I, we start asking the group to reflect on what they've learned about the evolution of the camp. It's a really interesting space where they can see how the camp started and how it grew from there. So who would have been going through those spaces? But the other question that we can ask them at that space when they look at this through the piece that we've created is we ask them to think about, what does this gate, what's this here for now? And they can see visitors in the space in situ now. So it opens up a discussion about the history they're learning about, but it also allows us to have the conversation about memorialization and commemoration. Similarly, when we go to, when they're looking at the unloading ramp, we ask them to think about the history, what was going on there at the time, what does this space tell us about the history you've been learning about? And then again with the barrack, we want the group who have been learning about Auschwitz-Birkenau to think about the fact that when they hear from survivors, so survivor testimony is threaded throughout the online platform, when they hear from survivors, it's really important that we also remember Auschwitz-Birkenau wasn't a place intended for life. There are barracks there, and they see the spaces from the barracks, but it wasn't built for that. So it allows us to grapple with different themes and issues they've covered. Once they've seen that, we still have, for the final part of the facilitated learning, one of the things that we thought was really important, and something again we had to kind of consider, was that when we are in situ at Auschwitz-Birkenau, at the end of the day, we have a moment for reflection. The group are kind of guided through a commemorative moment. And one of the things that we find from feedback from students is that moment to think and reflect is really important. So again, we have built something similar into the online platform. So at the end of the live facilitated sessions, the group do come together to have time to reflect, not to stop and think about what they've learned, not to think about how they're going to share what they're doing, but to actually just stop and think for themselves, to be able to kind of be there and think about this. And when we started thinking about it, this was one of the moments that we thought could again be quite difficult in an online forum, but we have built a kind of approach to that seems to work and gives the group time and space to think about that. One of the final things that I'm going to mention is that the group is still expected, so all participants are still expected to complete their next steps. And something that we found very interesting through the online delivery of the Lessons from Auschwitz project is that we're still seeing the group engaging through the next steps part. They're still delivering their next steps. But interestingly, we've noticed that there's more online next steps delivery. So instead of going into schools to deliver assemblies, to create projects, art installations, we're actually seeing quite a few participants, more than usual, delivering online videos or podcasts to share what they've been learning. And I think in terms of this conversation about the online world and how this works with Holocaust education, it's interesting to see that that's now feeding through into how young people are then sharing what they've been learning.
Thank you so much, Clementine. So one thing that you've touched on there, perhaps the most obvious thing about the ways in which, or how and why, Holocaust education and education around Auschwitz has moved to a digital online world is because of the pandemic. Obviously, museums and exhibitions were closed for, well, a good part of 2020 and 2021 as well. So Paweł, could you talk a little bit about what sort of challenges the pandemic has brought to your projects and to educating about Auschwitz?
Where should I start? So yes, we were always so proud to say that Auschwitz Memorial is closed only 3 days a year. And since 1947, we cannot track the earliest years, but we can say that over 50 million people visited. And then during the pandemic year, I think 168 days at least, or even more, we were closed. And that was very challenging. And but there are many aspects of how the pandemics made us realize about many different challenges. Because on one hand, these numbers that kept growing became worrisome, because in what crowd can this education be, and the experience of being at the authentic sites can be respectful, and to what extent it can become also a logistical challenge. And the authentic site is not out of rubber, and there is a limited number of people we can have in a day. Despite, of course, one of the most difficult decisions for us to take is to put up a sign, we're full, and you came from Costa Rica to see this place, once in your lifetime, and then the museum will say, no, you cannot see it because we're full. And so the pandemic showed us that that maybe we can think of where to build such limits and how to build that kind of experience to the authentic site. And I'm just reminding the first few weeks after we reopened after the first lockdown, where we had 100 visitors a day, 300 visitors a day, and we learned as educators and also people who are coming that that this brings a completely different possibility for a person to have this experience when they are basically by themselves. And of course, we use headsets and the guides. So we use many tools to have this close contact on one hand between the authentic site and the visitor, and an educator and a visitor. But we made some changes in the exhibition because of the restrictions. So we removed many of the horizontal display cases with some documents, and it created more space. And we kind of became a little bit more minimalistic. And this also brought forward the work of an educator, because it's much more the responsibility for this person to explain the context, because the site is always first, and this will be also the core of the new exhibition. But there are two projects that we are now in the very final stage of developing that really started because of the pandemic, because we were in social media before, we had the website before, the educational center had some online session, and now we are adding more translation options because also the technology moved forward and it allows automated transcription and simultaneous translation on Zoom and so on. So we are shifting a lot of these activities that are at the site, but now we have cameras and so on. We added podcasts to our range of possibilities, and the On Auschwitz podcast with we're getting close to the 20th episode. It is something very interesting to allow people to listen about very specific content, very specific part of the Auschwitz story in a very in-depth form. That was our goal, that we can have our historians talking about many different aspects. And usually during a visit or even during a study tour, you simply cannot listen for 40 minutes about Monowitz, or to really listen in depth about our new research on why Auschwitz became an extermination camp, because we have some new interpretation based on our research. But there are two projects that will see the light of the day this year. One is an online visit. And we are, because of the pandemic and because of the closure, we had an Israeli company, AppsFlyer, that reached us, and they said, we heard about the museum's problems, also financial situation, and so we want to help. And we are the technological company. And so we want to build and help you create an online live visit. And this is something that will happen in a few months, that our guides will be able to guide people who will be sitting on the screen, and the guides will be at the site, and they will have this live contact, and the people will see the site, the exhibition, the length of the tour will be very close to a regular tour. And this is something new that we're going to learn. And if you think about it, it really gives tremendous possibilities to kind of go a step further from what was said about the Lessons of Auschwitz online project, that there will be a far more possibility because of the technology that we're building, that will get the different layers of visual, because the online tour will allow looking at photographs, listen to testimonies, having some videos in, for example, you can walk through the barbed wire fence in Auschwitz I, and people will be able to see the video of children after liberation walking in the same place. So there are the online guided tour will finally how to liberate us from some kind of a logistic impossibilities, because when we, for example, talk about the development of Birkenau and we are at the site, we have to start at the gate which shows the situation from 1944, and it's simply impossible to be at the site of the first 2 gas chambers of Birkenau in the forest, despite chronologically it's a much more when from the chronological point of view, we could jump from one place to place. And there will be many formats an educator will be able to use in this online visit. One of the tools, we will really be able to put these puzzles. So we will be able to be there and there and there, thanks to some of the videos that we will also record. So the guide can also explain some of the pre-recorded things and build kind of a completely different experience, completely different educational thing. So please check our website, it's coming soon. And I'm not saying that now we'll be able to guide 5,000 people in a group, although technology will allow this, but certainly something new will open on a very standard level. But then thanks to our cooperation with many institutions, we will be able to tailor and build a completely new way of cooperation. And the second thing that is happening right now, and we're also in this final stage, is the virtual reality. And there was a company that we discovered that they started working on some sort of a virtual reconstruction of the camp, and we met and we get in touch, and we trusted each other. And because this technology is very difficult, because until recently, virtual reality could give you a computer game quality, which we didn't want to have. And they showed us that with proper technology and proper knowledge of how to build computer models, you can really get close to a reconstruction of the site based on archive material, scans, being at the site, and then the in-depth of the details that they are reaching is something that blows your mind. I mean that they are building the train car that is standing at the unloading platform Birkenau, and thanks to the technological drawings, they know that there were thousands and thousands of little nails or nits, and they reconstruct every single one of them. I mean, it's not kind of a building of painting a facade. They are going into in-depth detail, so people will even be able to study the structure of the roof of the crematoria. And I'm sure Robert Jan van Pelt will be one of the first person to put these goggles and go into these different layers. So we start from reconstruction of Birkenau, because Auschwitz I, to its large extent, exists. Of course, there are some losses of the authentic space and structures, but one of the big questions that many people ask is, how did Birkenau look like? And of course, we have some aerial footage from the Soviet army and so on. We have some aerial photographs, but actually to understand the camp, how these buildings look like when you only have the sea of ruins, was one of the key questions. And the memorial cannot reconstruct. This is out of our mandate of the creation of the museum. We only preserve whatever is authentic. But the virtual reconstruction will allow people to put the goggles on. Also, it will be an on-screen possibility, and we will be able to show things. The people who analyze, for example, the Lily Jacob album, they really managed to find the exact models of many of the cars that are there, and they reached to technological drawings, and they reconstructed even a bicycle. Even there is a SS bicycle. What precisely the model that is visible in the picture. So nothing is imaginary in this reconstruction. Everything is enrooted in reality. And then, of course, some of you may think, so now how can we do it? And this is not so easy. Like the online tour will be a general educational thing. I mean, everyone will be able to access. And they will be able to see the site, because this is what we do. It will be kind of an extension of the visit at the memorial. With the virtual reality, we must be much more careful, because we do not want to just leave it to the open so that people will be able to access it freely, because there are risks of these very new technologies. Someone will try to turn it into a game, or people will start using this kind of a possibility of moving around Birkenau freely to do some things that are disrespectful. So in the first stage, when we finally finish the platform, it will be accessible at the memorial for educational groups that come, and we'll have seminars. And this will be like the second layer of a seminar, that after visiting Birkenau, people will be able to look at some of these structures and to understand the development of Birkenau. And of course, in the later stages, we plan to have Auschwitz I. We hope to build monoliths with this virtual reconstruction. So the plans are now, when we see that this is finally possible, you know, the plans are big, but of course it's a huge financial challenge. I mean, this is not just taking few pictures and making few digital scans. I mean, working on one object can take weeks or months, and it must be really, really accurate, and that's our challenge. So here but of course we are now reopening more, and there are more visitors coming, so all the activities that were part of the memorial are happening, and we do hope that it will go back to some sort of a post-pandemic more normality. But if you ask about the real change that the pandemic brought to us, these are the two projects. And as with most of our educational projects, like Auschwitz exhibition, like our first virtual panorama, we're not doing things in a rush, that right now we need to have this and this and this exhibition, virtual, online. We worked very hard during this 2 years to make sure that everything we launch will kind of fit the standards that we have. It's not just to have some technological fireworks and be able to say, oh, we are just, you know, having this and this online things. But I think this is a big step forward for especially the giving people all around the world to have an online tour with our educator, to have this connection with the authentic site. This will be a big change in our world.
Thank you, Paweł. I think Olivia has actually put a link to the Auschwitz VR website in the chat as well, which has, I know it has a few images on there for anyone who's interested to have a look at that, and it sounds amazing. Paul, could you talk a little bit about the challenges that the pandemic has caused for a traveling exhibition that can't open, and how you sort of worked around those where possible?
Sure. Well, the pandemic, of course, touched all our lives in such deeply profound ways, didn't it? In terms of the museum and our exhibitions, of course, for many months, our doors were closed to visitors. To be honest, for a while, we didn't know when we'd be able to reopen them, or when we did, if visitors would actually return. I remember when I mentioned we were intending a kind of real cultural event with the size and the scale of the exhibition as it moves from city to city, to build a really strong educational impact around it as well. So it would have a really major legacy. And then with the pandemic, I remember there being many discussions in the field if this was the end of this type of museum, you know, these very large, like the exhibition on Tutankhamun that was traveling so successfully before the pandemic, and unfortunately, actually, I believe hasn't been able to recover from it, or the you know, the Terracotta Army exhibitions. It's of that kind of scale. So we were hardest hit really in New York City. We opened there at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and they'd actually taken out their entire core exhibition, their permanent exhibition, in order to make room for Auschwitz not long ago, not far away, because it is so large. And the exhibition had been extremely successful there, as it had been in Madrid, where it premiered, and it was setting record numbers in New York. And then it stood empty, right? The objects were there in place on display, and no one was able to attend. When the museum did reopen, it did so very cautiously, with greatly reduced numbers allowed in, as Paweł was saying, was the case, of course, at Auschwitz itself as well. Everyone in masks, of course, clearly marked routes for people to follow, that one-way system. And, you know, it was slow at first, but people did return. we were due to move to Kansas City following New York. And, you know, at one point I didn't know whether that would go ahead or not, but it did, and we're hugely grateful it went ahead as planned. Again, not knowing what the response would be when they start to market those tickets and start to try and sell those tickets. But in the event, incredibly, the exhibition set record figures for that venue in Kansas in its more than 20-year history. So, you know, it has higher visitor numbers during still this period of the pandemic than it ever did for any other exhibition before the pandemic. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, I think. And at the same time, the Seeing Auschwitz exhibition opened in San Sebastian in Spain, a much smaller exhibition, but it too set record numbers for that venue. It's presently showing in Madrid, and the Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away exhibition will open at the end of May in Malmö in Sweden, which of course we're very excited about. So, you know, we've recovered. I think people are coming back to these museums. It shows I think the power of the artifacts, the objects, the testimonies, the importance of and significance of the story. So we don't know what the future holds. Of course, we don't know what new variants will bring. We're not future-proofed in that way, but I can say right now, at least, visitors are coming and are engaging very deeply. So.
Great, thank you, Paul. So I think we've heard quite a lot there about the difficulties that the pandemic presented, obviously with physical sites being closed, with being inaccessible, but then also perhaps we've heard some of the benefits as well, in terms of allowing people who otherwise couldn't visit the Auschwitz Museum or one of these traveling exhibitions to see the sites, the traveling exhibitions that people can go to. They can see the artifacts up close, many of which have never been on public display before, I know. I wanted to shift the conversation slightly and draw upon your collective expertise as people, you know, and experts in sort of Holocaust education more generally, and think about the interaction between Holocaust memory and digital technology, and how this has increased not just in sort of during the pandemic, but of course has been perhaps accelerated by it. So, you know, we've had many examples over the last few years of people taking selfies at the Auschwitz Museum, which has caused a lot of controversy and debate. We've had during lockdown, TikTok becoming very popular, and this trend of young people dressing up as Holocaust victims and sort of from a point of view, sharing their experience and often sort of sharing their story, which again has caused, you know, a lot of criticism. So I wanted to ask you, how might this reliance on digital technology that we've all had, particularly over the last 2 years, impact upon visitors' behaviour when they return to sites like the Auschwitz Museum once things have sort of faded away, so to speak, with the pandemic? Clementine, I wonder if we could start with you on this question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we start to come out of a post-pandemic world, and, you know, as Paweł was saying, they're seeing visitor numbers increasing again, I think there's a lot for us to consider as a kind of as a sector. I think for us at HET, given the model that we kind of run the Lessons from Auschwitz project through, when we're at AuschwitzBirkenau with guides and with our freelance educators, because we're with quite small groups and it's facilitated, I must say the kind of, I guess, behaviours around selfies and the sometimes challenging behaviours you may see at sites, we haven't really seen, and I think that's part of because of how we bring a group. But I'm, you know, very aware of the things that we're talking about here, and I think, honestly, I think the question of what will happen post-pandemic, the most kind of obvious answer is I don't think any of us know for sure, but I think what we can do as a sector is that we can ensure that as we prepare groups to go to authentic sites and as we facilitate their visits, we're doing all we can to ensure that they understand the context of where they're going, that they fully understand what they're seeing, and that they have had time to really think about and grapple with what it means to be at a site, how you how you engage with the site. And part of that is about thinking about kind of how it is to behave respectfully and what that means to be there and what you can learn from what you can see and what you'll hear. So I think the preparation for site-based learning is really important. I think, to be honest, it's not a new question for people in the sector. You know, when we're thinking about Holocaust education and visiting sites, these are questions we have all grappled with. I think the difference is the time and space that we're talking about is different. And for us, I think we have a responsibility to ensure whatever year it is that we're thinking about the context within which those visitors are going there. And we have to make sure that our preparation is taking into account that context. So I do think there will be particular issues. I think something that we all have to consider is that I do think there will be perhaps a challenge when we go back to more visits and being in person. There may be a challenge around how people have engaged with Holocaust education over the last 2 years. I'm very mindful, you know, thinking about students as an example. They've had 2 years where their timetables are completely different. Teachers have lots of pressures, and it's been a really tough 2 years for as a learner for students to go through that time. So people may be arriving at sites without the same type of understanding and knowledge. And also, I think we know that there is a kind of ever increasing reliance on using social media for information. And I think it may be that we are seeing people arriving with oversimplified narratives or reductive narratives of what the Holocaust was and what the spaces are that they're looking at. Again, I think for us as educators, we have to take on the responsibility of ensuring that we understand that context and we know where groups that we're taking to sites are in terms of that learning and understanding. And I think, you know, for us, as I said, I don't know that it's a new question, but the scenario is different. For us, we have to make sure that we continue to do all we can to bring groups to sites with the contextual understanding and the kind of emotional intelligence that they require to engage with sites.
Thank you, Clem. Paul, what are your thoughts on this question?
There's a strong tension, isn't there, between when we want our visitors and our students and our young people to genuinely engage with this difficult past and to make meaning from it and not to impose our own positions onto them, and then to trust them to behave in what we consider to be a responsible way. That tension can sometimes unwittingly, I think, create a structure where the students are inhibited to say what they really want to say or what they want to ask. So I think we have to be careful that we don't misinterpret what might be a way of coping with a difficult situation, such as taking a selfie or asking a particular question or making a remark, you know, that we don't over respond or over regulate this kind of behavior, because you know, we don't own this past. It is difficult, it's unsettling, it's potentially traumatic, and if we want to have young people make their own sense of it, then I think we need to ask the kinds of questions that we're genuinely struggling with ourselves and try to reduce the hierarchy between us and the learner in a way that allows us to have genuine conversations, not only about the past, but also what it means today. So I think there are ways in which social media, digital technologies can facilitate that and enhance it, and at its best, democratize conversations and allow voices to be heard that wouldn't otherwise be. And of course, there's the tension, the difficulty, the danger of misinformation and of people not being able to unpack and unpick what they can rely upon and who is an authoritative voice. And then I think you play into that mix that because of the nature of this history and how difficult many of these questions are to confront, there can be an understandable urge to resolve the past in a certain kind of a way, rather than confronting it. And so I think our challenge, our question throughout all our educational work, not only in terms of issues like digital media or social digital responses, is how we host those conversations in an open way, but one which, of course, doesn't allow deep offence to be caused and harm, or, of course, even violent rhetoric to kind of come out. So, I think we're still learning. I'm working on a project at the moment for the UN, which is trying to, with Oxford University, looking at social media on 5 different platforms in 4 languages, looking at Holocaust denial and distortion, and what we can try to learn from these sorts of representations. And, it's not easy. I don't think there's a simple answer here, but I think, we also have a lot of good faith material, a lot of good actors out there. And I think it's how we can also stimulate communities of learners to engage more deeply with this kind of conversation. In other words, not only just about the past, but what the past means in the present and for us today.
Definitely. Yes, I agree with that as well, in terms of, rather than sort of shutting down young people, which I think sometimes there's a temptation to do, particularly in the media, it's really important to have that more kind of open discussion rather than debate even, and ask those questions. Paweł, as the person who sort of represents the museum on social media, who's on the front line of a lot of this, so to speak, what's your take on this?
People like to look at it as very black and white thing. I mean, either very critical, or everything should be absolutely free and we should allow people to do everything. And I think the real challenge is to try to dwell into all the different tones and understand that. But something that I always bring up when I talk to media, because, for example, media are creating this kind of a world where they are very interested in this. I mean, tell us how the visitors, what wrong they do. And this is interesting. I mean, there's no television crew coming to the Auschwitz Memorial. And again, today, 5,000 people walked through this site and nothing happened. And they learned, and they commemorated, and they cried. And so we shouldn't take it out of the proportion. When you look at, I think right now close to 530,000 pictures with Auschwitz hashtag on Instagram, majority of them will be better and worse pictures, but that are taken in good faith, even if it's a selfie. I mean, picture with that big picture should be analyzed with a motivation. And sometimes this is the only language that these people know, and they are in the place and they want to commemorate them being there. So everything is very complicated, and most of the things that are happening and that are seen online are non-controversial, are simply people trying to get engaged with this memory. And something that is at the edge, which is extreme, draws attention because it's loud, and media like that. And I know that if the Auschwitz Memorial Twitter account will, put our finger and someone did something wrong, and some company did something, or some politician or celebrity or whoever did something wrong, they will write about this immediately, and no one is going to again check what 12 individuals and their names and birthdays and faces we posted on Twitter, because this is something that we should be doing. So, but I think it's, on one hand, we have some sort of obligation to hold our hand on the pulse and see where the trends are happening, and check if there may be some sort of a more general problematic things happening in terms of memory. But as Paul said, people behaving a little bit less regularly in places like this is not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is anti-Semitism, Holocaust distortion, Holocaust denial, hatred, how to make the social media companies responsible and how to make them engaged, and what they can do instead of promoting and the algorithms to simply put things that are spreading disinformation, hatred online, how to make them be part of this discussion, and how to make them limit something that they created. I mean, there are bigger problems, I think, than what we are saying. But also, But we need to look at it. We need to have this understanding. We need to go into understanding why people do that, because it also can give us an educational opportunity. And something, for example, you know, I'm not a researcher. I do things, and some other people research what I do. But for example, I think that from the moment we are present on Instagram, and 99% of the photographs we post them are basically pictures taken by the visitors that we choose as a kind of a good example. And we push those photographs in this online space for every day and every week and every year for the last few years. I think, and maybe someone has a research numbers, that I have, because I collect these problematic pictures, that I have less and less to collect. That working every day, kind of a silent educational work, making people aware that some things may not be appropriate, that maybe you should stop posting at some point because one more picture can be too much, and showing that you can have this good, respectful quality in terms of your engagement with the history of the site. I think this also brings benefit. I mean, one thing are those loud cases where something goes wrong, and then we need to think how to fix it and how to maybe find ways to address people. But I think that building on presenting this silent majority that are respectful and good, and showing these examples and promoting it, rather positive than negative, but doing it in a long-term perspective, not just 1 day, 2 days, but this is what should we be doing, is another part of our responsibility.
Thank you, Paweł. As someone who has researched the museum on social media, that's really interesting to hear as well. Sorry, Clementine, did you want to add something?
Is that okay if I'll keep
yes,
it
of course,
brief,
yeah.
I promise. I know we've got other questions, but I just wanted to pick up on something that, something that Paul mentioned about trust in students, and also kind of keeping our finger on the pulse that Paweł was just saying about trends in how people engage in social media. And I think something that's probably quite interesting for this group and this discussion is that often when we hear about the kind of the question that you asked, the reliance on digital technologies and the challenges that we've seen, I think we are often talking about, often not always, young people and how they engage with social media. And I think that sense of trust in how they're using, how they're engaging, and trusting that that they are there with the right intentions is really important. And I think if we can shift our kind of way of thinking to see that we can learn from them as well, it will really enhance what we can offer through our programs. And I think for us to follow trends that, you know, we can see across people that are native to these types of platforms, that use these platforms day in, day out, we're constantly learning, right? How do we engage with Instagram? It's a new thing to lots of us, and in terms of our organizations and what we are doing. And I think we're often a step behind. And I think, you know, we have a responsibility to understand how we're using it before we do. But I just thought it was a really interesting point that Paul raised about that trust. And I think there's something that we can learn if we're kind of doing this sensibly, learn from the people that are using social media, and think about how we are ensuring that we're kind of following those, keeping up with trends, to ensure that we can use a platform that can offer a lot of opportunity if it's used responsibly.
Okay, I think Paweł's got a really quick response, and then we have time for some audience questions.
Very quick, just additional thing, that when we look about monitoring trends and seeing challenges outside of the museum spaces, I mean, it's probably a topic for a completely different discussion, but what the modern literature and culture is doing to memory right now, with writers writing new books about Auschwitz, starting from The Tattooist and Lullaby and others, without any factual research, without just publishing new books, because this is the stories that people are buying, and people, this creates a distortion to the level that is far beyond any little social media problems that we're talking about, because people start learning history from these. And I think we are still had a very big discussion and debate of how to start defending memory against this kind of also the motivation of many of the authors is maybe good, but they go shortcuts and they do not study story and they do not go into research. And this is something that young and old people right now are getting, but in social media you can also find plenty of this when people say what books they wrote, and then this causes so much harm for us as educators that this is another challenge, just throwing another point for discussion.
Definitely something to consider more widely there. Okay, so we have a little bit of time for audience questions. I have one here from Daniel Reynolds. So I'm going to sort of summarize what he sent me. He's talking about this notion of authenticity and the authentic site. And he says that some people, not necessarily him, but other people challenged the notion of authenticity because of the sort of presence of reconstruction, or the fact that the site wasn't sort of static, it sort of changed and evolved over the years. So he says kind of that the simple question that he'd like to put to you is, what do we mean by the authentic site? Who would like to come in on that? Quite a big question.
Since I happen to represent the authentic sites, I would have to think about it, because it is challenging, because Auschwitz changed. But from the preservation point of view, the authentic site is a compromise, indeed, because Auschwitz was a finally 40 square kilometer zone of interest with 2 main camps in between, and then sub camps and so on. So this is preserved in a more research things, but things survived. And whether it will be just a ruin of a building, and we have ruins of gas chambers and crematoria, and whether it will be just a site where a place existed, which is, for example, the first gas chamber, but whether it will be 110,000 shoes. On one hand, the notion of authenticity is everything that survived. And I think right now we are in a much better position to deal with this, because the conservation, so the science that preserves authenticity is much more sophisticated, and we can sometimes even return to the authentic shape of things because the conservation allows us to do so. Some changes that were done in 1950s, 1960s can now be removed, and we try to get to the level of authenticity. I'll just give you a short, and authenticity on many other levels can be understood differently. But just one example, I remember in a conservation lab, there are different students of conservation coming to learn how we do this. And I remember there were some students, I think coming from England, from one of the universities, and they had like a table that we had, or a stool, and it was a little bit broken and damaged. And their idea was that what they need to do is to fix it completely, repaint it so that this stool looks like a new thing. And we said, no, I mean, all these damages are also a historical, they tell the story of an object. They tell the story of destruction. When you have a suitcase which has some mud on it, can be the fact that in Canada, so in the sector where the items were stored, things were thrown into mud, and this mud will not be removed. On the other hand, preservation and making sure that everything that we know is authentic is presented, and also things that sometimes we need to add to save an object is also highlighted, that it's something new. It's also very important, also in the discussion with Holocaust deniers and so on, that things are not changed. So authenticity will be starting from this on a very tangible level, everything that remained. And in case of the Auschwitz Memorial, it is of course some kind of a compromise, but we can be there without anyone telling us, and the site itself, the authentic site, tells us some sort of a story. And then it's our role to also show that this authenticity is much more complex, because Birkenau didn't look like this in 1942, and there were changes and so on and so on. And hopefully the new technology will also allow us to show that, but it's our obligation. This is what the survivors wanted us to do, to preserve whatever remained, because we will see many other places where there's nothing authentic left. And there are just some stories, and people do not have this very personal connection, because I think for many visitors who come at the site, being at the site allows them to understand it in a completely different level, because they read books, they read stories, they saw films, and suddenly it all comes to the site that still is able to speak to them. And we cannot lose this voice that the site has. And I think when we can talk also about the authenticity of the words and the authenticity of the testimonies, and of course the books or testimonies that were recorded in 1950s and 1960s or right after the war in 1940s have a completely different dimension that some of the much later videos that were done. But this authenticity will be only very soon recorded only in archives and institutions, because we'll have no more survivors. And the preservation of the authentic space, whatever is left there, and with all the problems and challenges, is becoming more and more obligation to us. So, but there are so many paths we can go from this question that it's a very random thought that I could just think of.
Thanks, Paweł. I'm just very aware of the time, but would Clementine or Paul, would you like to add anything to that?
Just briefly, if you like, just one story from the Auschwitz exhibition, of course, which is built on authentic artifacts, original objects, some 700 or so. But there is a particular artifact there with an extraordinarily powerful story of a young woman at the time and her lover, who gave her a tin ring in terrazine, engraved it, gave it to her at risk, a great risk, and she was deported. He was deported. She lost him. She was deported to Auschwitz, Stenke-Fandlover, and she was on the ramp and selected for the camp and in the sauna, and she hid that ring beneath her tongue at great risk to herself, and smuggled it through the camp and kept it with her, and survived, and had it at liberation and on the death march at liberation, and has it to this day. In the exhibition, we tell that story and we present the ring, but in facsimile. It's so out of all these 700 artifacts, original artifacts, these authentic artifacts, this one is not. But the honesty with which it's displayed is not just a simple note on the bottom of the caption, but in the audio tour, we make a particular point of telling the visitor that this is not the original one, for the reason that she allowed us to make the copy, but couldn't bear to be parted with it. It somehow adds even more to the story and the power and the importance of that object. This very elderly woman, this elderly survivor, kept that and wanted her story told, but somehow couldn't bear for it to be not with her, even in this safe place in a museum. So there's an authenticity to that story and the way that it's told, as well as the object. Even though the object is a facsimile, there's something honest, there's an integrity there, I think, and there's a power which comes out of it. So I think, just to speak to what Paweł's arguing there, being honest with the visitor about what is and what isn't remaining, and how things have to be concerned and why that takes place, inviting them into that discourse, is where the educational value lies, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. The question of authenticity is something that came up in my own sort of PhD research a lot, and I think this idea perhaps of authenticities is perhaps more applicable, because, as you say, there's so many complexities and layers to this. Clem, would you like to add anything else to that?
Very, very briefly, I think the authenticity piece, the authentic space, I think it's a space that tells a story about the history we're learning about. And I think we're thinking about original buildings, artifacts, spaces that have been preserved. We're thinking about things that have been rebuilt. And I also think we have to think about the spaces that are empty and the story that tells, and how you can learn about the gap that has been left by the history and what happened there, and what some sites that's you're trying to grapple with a group to learn about history by saying, this is a space. What does that tell us? The fact that there is nothing here now. And I think in terms of what it means to be looking at an authentic space, I think it's the places where we have things that are still there or things that have been reconstructed, but also those places that now have nothing because of what happened.
Thank you, Clem. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We had a couple of other questions, so I'm so sorry we didn't get to those. We've had some lovely comments as well in the chat from some of our attendees. And this is something that I'm sure the four of us, and indeed everyone else watching, could sit and talk about for hours. But it leaves me to say thank you so much to all our three wonderful panelists for your insights, your contributions. I really encourage everyone to look at some of those links that have been posted, to give all the organisations on social media a follow as well, the Auschwitz Museum, Salmons Associates, Paul Salmons as well, and the Holocaust Educational Trust. I would also like to thank my colleague Olivia for her technical support, for giving up her time this evening, and of course to you, all our attendees, for joining us. So thank you all very much. And this will be, as I say, recorded. It has been recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube probably after the bank holiday weekend. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much to everybody and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.